Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Images of the Jordanian Air Force pilot dressed in an orange suit, caged and burnt alive shocked the world. Sadly, these were neither the first nor the worst of the Islamic State brutality. Journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotlov were killed with unparalleled ruthlessness. These pictures that you see all around you. The ISIS flaunts its brutality and taunts the world. These may shock you and I, but for some reason it gets the ISIS more recruits across the world. Today, we have in our midst people who have survived the ISIS horror. Nicolas Henin is a French journalist. He was captured by the Islamic State in Syria in 2013. He lived through hell for 10 months. He shared a cramped prison cell with hostages like James Foley, Stephen Sotlov, David Hines, and Alan Henning. They were all executed. He survived. Today he will tell us how. Theo Padnos, when I first read about his story, he survived 22 months in an Al-Nusra, that's an Al-Qaeda affiliate, 22 months in an Al-Qaeda prison. It's only his sheer willpower that he survived to tell us how he did that. It's horror that you may have read, but today you will hear of it firsthand. What is this Islamic State? Why do they kill with such brutality? Why do they flaunt it? Why does that ideology attract people from across the world? And what's the threat that it poses to the world? What's the threat to India? Professor Bernard Haeckel, he is the foremost authority on the ISIS. Governments consult him. He's on the dais with me, as is Amrullah Saleh. Is this ISIS a distant threat, or is that danger closer home? Amrullah Saleh led the intelligence operations against the Taliban. He set up Afghanistan's intelligence agencies and was appointed the director of Afghanistan's intelligence agencies by the Karzai government. He joins us on the dais, and I want to start by asking Nicolas, the world's worst nightmare, Nicolas, you lived through that nightmare for 10 months. How did that nightmare begin?
How did that begin? It began just with an abduction. But I was not the only one abducted. Actually, there has been an abduction that was probably, well, that was for sure much, much worse than mine. It was the abduction of a peaceful and very democratic revolution. Today, exactly today, we are celebrating, well, not much to celebrate, but today we are marking the 4th anniversary of the Syrian revolution. That was a tremendous hope for a population that for the very first time of its history had a chance to take control of its destiny. And this revolution has been hijacked. It has been first repressed extremely brutally by the Syrian regime, and it has been later on hijacked and abducted by these people, by the very same people who abducted me. And you were talking about horror, about nightmare. My nightmare, my friend, was nothing compared to the one of the Syrian people.
I can understand that. Now, you shared a prison cell with Foley, with Sotlov, with Heining. These were people you were in the same prison cell with. Describe to us what was life in prison like. They were taken out, they were executed, you survived. How did they know who to kill? Did you know who would be killed and who would survive?
Well, we knew very little because the captors would let you know very little. So I shared my cell with people who were released and people who got killed. This is life.
What was prison like? What was your conversation with fellow inmates, with the captors?
Well, it was especially boring. It was a lot about how to to kill time. And, Syria is full of weapons of mass destruction, but nothing that is efficient enough to kill something as terrible as time.
Okay. I was reading one of your experiences, Nicholas, where you've written, you were the hedgehog. Describe what animal are you closest to?
I wrote actually 2 books. This is a children's book that I wrote during my time in captivity, and it was the pictures are from a fellow cellmate who was taken with me and released with me, and this is the story of a hedgehog. But this is not especially the book I'm here for. My main book is Jihad Academy, and this is a book that explains to the public. Unfortunately, so far it's only in French. It was just released in France, and this book is about how to understand the conflict in Syria and how to understand the situation in Iraq, because everything we know, the whole ISIS has a background. It does not come out of nothing. It comes from, history. It's, in a way, a revenge of history. It's a revenge on the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, and it's a revenge on the passivity of the world after the beginning of the Syrian revolution 4 years ago, day by day, for now.
Now, this is brutality for some reason which most of the world doesn't even understand. These are people who would keep high-definition cameras. They'd attach those high-definition cameras to the barrel of their gun and then go around shooting people so that they can capture their kill and then put it on YouTube to attract more people. So this is brutality. You just don't understand. Why do they do that? Did you interact with them? Did you get to hear something?
They do that exactly to shock you. They want to provoke us. They want to shock us. And they are even looking for the best way possible to shock us. Oh, let's enslave Yazidis. Oh, it's cool. It makes the headline in the West. So let's enslave even more Yazidis. Oh, the destruction of antiquities. Oh, it works. It makes the headline. Have you seen that? The headlines? Yes, let's destroy more antiquities. Provocation is their message. It helps because it pushes us to overreact. And overreaction is bad because it makes us react with some kind of brutality and lack of distance, while efficient fight of terrorism requires subtlety and morale.
Okay.
So this violence and this provocation is also extremely efficient, of course, to attract lost kids, potential jihadis.
Theo, you were a prisoner for 22 months of the Al-Qaeda, and you literally delivered yourself to your captors. Tell us your story.
Right. I think I made a mistake. What can I tell you? I met some nice young men in Antakya, Turkey, in October of 2012, and in fact, I was very reluctant to trust them. But I felt that I needed to trust somebody if I wanted to go down into Syria, and I trusted the wrong people. What can I tell you? I just went with the wrong people. As soon as we entered into Syria, we slept in a house the first night, and the next day they took me to an abandoned house outside of the city of Aleppo, and filming everything they did. They beat me and took me into custody, and they said, "You are our prisoner now. We are from the Al-Qaeda organization. Give us your money. Shut up."
So this wasn't just a robbery. This wasn't youngsters robbing you. They took your money, they beat you up, but they had a bigger design.
I'm not sure. They told me right away. They said, "Listen, either we kill you in a week or you come up with a 1/4 kilo of gold," which is the amount that the Quran entitles us to. I said, "Okay, I'll give you the 1/4 kilo of gold. Kindly don't kill me." And they said, they put me in handcuffs, and then we went to another house, and we slept that night. And in the morning, I ran away from them, and I ended up at the Free Syrian Army, who were supposedly our friends and nice people. I said, help me, help me, help me. I've been kidnapped by terrorists. And they said, sit down, no problem, we'll solve the issue. And they gave me back to my kidnappers. Too bad.
You escaped too, Nicholas. Just the very third night, the third day of your capture, you escaped, but you were caught. Did their attitude change? Describe to us how you managed to escape and how were you caught?
Well, I just found a way to break the bars of my cell. And so on my third day, I broke them, of captivity, I broke them, and I jumped out of my of the cell. I ran in the desert for, a few hours, and early in the morning, I found people. They were mujahideen, they were in pajamas, so I didn't know that they were mujahideen because, there is no difference between civilian and mujahideen when you see just men in pajamas. And they caught me back, and they took me back to the very same cell.
Now, both of you, you weren't kept in the same prison throughout. In your 22 months, you changed, I think, 13 prisons. In your 10 months, you changed a large number of prisons. 13 again. So, were they on the run? Were they running around a lot of running from authorities, or they were the authorities?
In my case, my group was at war with his group. So these two were fighting each other, although they have the exact same religion. And in fact, many of the same people, they switched back and forth. But one day, the commander of his group said that the commander of my group was bad, so they had a fight. All the soldiers began killing each other, and his group beat my group. And we had to flee from that group into the desert, which we did. And but at a certain point, yes, he and I were in the exact same prison, in the exact same cell. However, I was there a year before he was there.
Yeah, this is crazy. I mean, we shared the same cell, but the prison changed hands. Well, the control of this prison changed from a group to another, but it remained a prison, and we were in the same cell a year apart.
Were you beaten up in prison? Did they torture you in prison, or people around you, specifically the foreigners? Were foreigners, Western journalists, aid workers, were they kept separately and other prisoners kept separately?
I'll be happy to answer that question. I mean, in my case, yes, the foreigners were kept separately for a period, although later they moved us in with members of the regime, the Syrian National Army, and also with people they accused of being shabiha, who are thugs, kind of militia activists who work on behalf of the regime, and also fighters from his group. So, I mean, I was in prison with a diverse cast of characters. And as for the torture, it's very systematic in these prisons. Every prison has a room in which they carry this thing out, these torture sessions. And I was there for 2 years almost. I mean, not every night, but let's say every other night or every third night, they would have somebody in the torture room. That's going on every day. I mean, it's what they do when they don't have anything else to do. There's really it's very systematic kind of approach to torture that they have at the moment.
So they torture when they have nothing else to do.
I mean, yes, they do. They don't do it for intelligence, which as some governments might, in order to extract information from the victim. I know that personally. I mean, they pretended a little bit, but I know that was not their real intention. I mean, they were doing this in order to exhibit their superiority and to render the torture victim terrified and helpless. And I mean, they much later on, they made a kind of a little show of trying to extract information, but basically, they wanted to inflict pain.
For the sake of inflicting pain, or because you follow a different religion?
I mean, you'd have to ask them what the deep motive is. I mean, to be honest, I think that they will tell you that I don't want to depress everyone with their horrible stories of torture, but they believe that it brings you closer to God when they make people who are harmful to Islam, as they believe me to be, suffer. So they competed with one another in order to have the opportunity to make me suffer. It brought them closer to God.
They would just come and kick you, break a rib or two.
Sometimes, yes. And other times they're more systematic kinds of torture.
Like?
Oh, they have to elaborate. They have chains. They have electricity, and they have sticks. They have cables. They have hanging from the pipes by your wrists. Believe me, it's not pretty.
And the jihadis are performing the very same kind of torture that the Syrian regime does.
That's true.
They learned the torture from their jail, and they are doing the very same. So I'm making no difference between all the torture. And as far as I know, there is not a single detention facility across Syria without at least one torture room.
Okay. Professor Haeckel, what's the draw of the Islamic State? Why would people, for example, Jihadi John, why would he leave the UK and become an ISIS terrorist?
I mean, there are different motivations for different people. I think that many of the Western converts to Islam or people who are Muslims who are joining because there's this utopian vision that the Islamic State presents. They've recreated a state called the Caliphate. It's where real, in quotes, Islam is being practiced. It's authentic. It's adventurous. You're performing God's will. So I think a number of people are attracted to that idea. For the Iraqis and for the Syrians who join, it's for more complicated reasons, I think. There it has to do with what was mentioned earlier, the destruction of Iraqi society because of Saddam Hussein's regime and then the American invasion, the sanctions before the invasion, the brutality of the Syrian regime for 40-plus years that systematically destroyed and disenfranchised Sunni Muslims. So the reasons in the region, in the Arab world, are different than for those who come from the West or from the rest of the world seeking to live the ideal Muslim life as they see it.
You know, because what appears to defy logic is why would 3 young British girls abandon their lives in the UK, fly to Turkey, and go into Syria to join the ISIS?
Yeah, we don't really actually have enough, statistically, a large enough number of people who are joining from outside to be able to make definitive conclusions. I mean, in the case of these 3 girls, it could be that they're, rebelling against their parents. That could be something that's attracting them to this cause. It's really impossible to make a determination based on small numbers. And the recruits from overseas, while there are a few thousand, are again not enough, given that there are, 1 billion plus Muslims around the world who could potentially be joining, but of course most of them, a vast majority of them are not. So the appeal is to a very small, self-selected group of Muslims who are joining.
The fear across the world is that once these people go to Syria and Iraq and fight along with these battle-hardened ISIS terrorists, and then they return to their countries, that could pose a real threat, whether it's to Europe, to America, perhaps even India.
Yeah, I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. That argument is based on the experience of jihad in Afghanistan when a number of Arabs went to Pakistan and Afghanistan and then came back after the end of the war and then joined other jihads, whether in Bosnia or then in Saudi Arabia or then with the 9/11 attacks. I think here what we're dealing with the Islamic State is something that is qualitatively different. The people who are going there typically are burning their bridges with their home countries. They literally are burning their passports very often. And often they're going there to die. They're not actually going there to come back. So in some ways, the idea of blowback, which is this idea that they will come back and inflict damage on their home societies, I don't think is borne out by the evidence that we have so far.
Theo, did you interact with any of the foreign terrorists, not Arabs, not Iraqi, not Syrian, but perhaps Westerners who were terrorists with ISIS?
Yeah, not with. I was in jail with the ISIS people who, they were Syrians and Iraqis that had been captured by my group because they had come into the city where I was being held prisoner on behalf of ISIS in order to kill Jabhat al-Nusra. So, but I did meet some Canadians and an Australian, Western jihadis that had come from the West in order to kill and die, as Professor Heikel says, on behalf of their notion of Islam.
What's the lure of ISIS? In France, for example, why would people want to go and join the ISIS?
Because it's cool.
It's cool.
Yes, this is the way they portray themselves. If you want to, if you have a problem with the society, if you have no life, if you want to rebel against your parents, then join ISIS. I mean, what will it bring to you? It will bring you adventure, a gun, and potentially a girl. Well, if you're
That's more than
an 18-year-old French guy living in a neighborhood and have no life, no culture, no destiny, and you want to do something exciting in your life, what do you do? And it's by the same way you will say, well, something really bad to, everybody. It's a way to express rebellion. It's a kind of...
it's like the Flower generation
walk,
did drugs.
Kind of, yes.
Well, I think you also would not want to underestimate the appeal of living a proper Islamic life, which these young men believe that they will undertake as soon as they arrive in in a completely Islamic place, such as the new caliphate. I mean, in Europe, it's very possible to live your life as a Muslim but feel very distant from the religion, from the language, from the Quran. And I think even more deeply than the longing for adventure and the longing for danger and authority, moral authority, is the longing for proximity to the ancient powers of the universe as expressed in Islam. You don't feel that when you are living in an anonymous polyglot suburb outside of London or Paris. But it is possible, I'm sure it is possible to feel that when you're living with the mujahideen, the fighters in Syria. You're praying so much, you're reading so much Quran, everything you do is in the name of God, and you feel very close to God. I'm sure they do, as they're doing all their horrible things.
No, but Professor, it's not such a rosy picture. They burn people, they decapitate people, they chop off their heads, chop off their limbs, they throw them off cliffs just for being gay. It just sounds so bizarre, and that's a way of life, and it actually encourages people to come and join them.
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, the Islamic State is much better at propaganda than any of the previous jihadi groups. So you have to remember that the production quality of their online social media videos and messaging is really of a very, very high quality, and it's very alluring or attractive to outsiders who are perhaps leading lives that are meaningless in the West, let's say. There's also a use of video games, and especially, Call of Duty, all kinds of games that young people play, and in a way, it's kind of a reenactment of that video game if you live that life, and those video games are very bloody and gory and have heads cut off and all the rest of it. So it's it's the video game, but the real version that they're trying to project. And I think that's quite attractive to a number of people. I mean, lastly, their reading of the sources of Islam, the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet, and so on, they focus on a literal and very select reading of the most violent bits of that tradition. So anything that, for instance, the Prophet did that was not violent, or that was peaceful, or that was tolerant, they ignore deliberately. So it is a kind of fantasy of a very violent Islam that they are deliberately producing. And now the question that I think should be asked for an Indian audience in particular is the remarkable fact that given that you have 150 million Muslims, that so few have actually been attracted to this vision, this very perverted vision of Islam. and so few have gone. And I think I don't know the answer as to why so few Indians have joined, but I suspect it has something to do with the democratic and the nature of your society here. That somehow Muslims feel, despite all the problems that they may face with discrimination and economic deprivation, relatively speaking, they nonetheless feel like they belong, that they're Indians.
Which is not the case in Europe or parts of the world.
I think is not the case with some of the young people.
But what about Pakistan? What about Afghanistan, Mr. Saleh? When you look at the situation, how different, if at all, are the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, and the ISIS?
Thank you. First of all, as a Muslim, I would like to suggest that we should not stereotype 3 British Muslims out of a population of 1 billion Muslims go to Syria, and we say, they go there to get closer to God. In some other non-Muslim countries, a crazy cult appear, and some people join it, and we should not attribute it to a religion because it is offensive to hundreds of millions of Muslims who are not ISIS. They are not part of that group. What difference is between the Taliban and ISIS? The Taliban were not putting their captives in orange, but the method of execution was probably different, but they have been massacring people for years. And it's a continuous problem. They still kill civilians. They still kill tribal chiefs. They still kill the notables. The difference is they sometimes do not parade them before the cameras or put the execution on Twitter. But if you go to the YouTube, you see how they have massacred the Afghan civilians and also how they have massacred their military captives. But remember, none of what I hear from these colleagues is a news for Afghans. I'm very glad they survived. But we have been facing ISIS-type situation for decades. We have been facing ISIS minus last S for 30 years. And they have been sponsoring ISIS-type groups against Afghanistan for such a long time. Now, the issue for Afghanistan is a principled stand that we expect the world to have against militant extremists, those who do not believe in pluralism, those who do not believe in dignity of society. They instead believe in glory of a group and degradation of the rest of the society. So if we come to a united stand and then define these groups, then Afghans have been the victim of ISIS type, as I said, brutality and murder for such a long time. So again, these stories get glorified. A European captured by ISIS or a European who walked into an ISIS territory and kept captive for such a long time. But if we put it in the context of Afghanistan, tens of thousands of Afghans over the last decade have been murdered, and so what is the story today? The story today is a narrative of reconciliation with Mullah Omar, who sits in Karachi. They want us to reconcile with him.
That's the point. Is there possibility of reconciliation? Can there ever be reconciliation with the ISIS in its current form? Can the ISIS be a legitimately acceptable form of governance, whether in Syria or parts of Iraq? They have a government, they have an oil minister, they have an education minister who comes from apparently Saudi Arabia or Egypt, they have a cleric who comes from Egypt, so they run a government. Can the West accept them?
No, they do run a government, and they have a state, and they're very proud.
Yeah.
They're very proud that they're called the Islamic State, and they insist on it surviving and remaining as such. But it's not a territorially bounded state. So it's not a state.
It's a transnational state, in fact.
Well, it's not a state as we understand a state. So it's not a nation state. It's a state that's constantly seeking to expand its frontiers and its boundaries through warfare. And at best, you can have a 10-year truce with them. So no, I don't think we could, or even the people of the region could, live with them. And one has to remember, first and foremost, that it's the people of the region, Muslims, who are their principal victims. Yes. Right? So it's not just about the West, it's not just about India, it's really about the Iraqis and the Syrians and the others in this region who are suffering under their rule. And they do rule over 8 million people.
And a territory that's larger than Great Britain at this point of time. I was on board the USS Carl Vinson last week. It's in the Persian Gulf. And thousands of sorties were being carried out, bombing sorties over Mosul, Tikrit, parts of both Iraq and Syria. Are they any good? Are they achieving the kind of aim that they've set out to achieve? Any positive results of these bombings?
You know, the U.S. military and military power with respect to a group like ISIS is a very blunt instrument. You can destroy them militarily, but to truly eliminate them, you have to eliminate the structural and societal and political factors that produce this kind of phenomenon. And that's a much more difficult problem to face. So in other words, ISIS is a symptom of the political, social, and economic breakdown and dysfunction of Iraqi society, Syrian society, and to some extent other societies, you know, Libya, for instance, and so on. So to address those problems cannot be destroyed with an F-16 or an F-15. It's a much longer problem and process that cannot be addressed by military power.
In our region, Mr. Saleh, is there fear? The kind of vacuum that existed in Mosul, the Iraqi army was extremely unpopular at one point of time. When the ISIS, their tanks and their Toyota pickups and AK guns, they rolled into Mosul, people actually welcomed them. They occupied a vacuum. Some of that vacuum actually exists in the AFPAC region. Can some form of ISIS take control there? Does that pose a threat to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and perhaps even India?
Well, first about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a very changed country thanks to over a decade of pluralistic system we have had and billions of aid that was poured into the country. Afghanistan today is united against extremism. In the 90s, Taliban was a cause. Today they have been reduced to a group. So we are not trying to diminish a cause. We are trying to finish off a group which is challenging the writ of the state and the pluralistic society that Afghanistan has today. Two, ISIS is very sectarian, and Afghan society in it is blood, genetically in our DNA. We are not sectarian. You do not hear Afghans creating violence on the day of Ashura or the 10th of Muharram procession. There is no Shia-Sunni divide within Afghanistan. Look at us. For 40 years, we have been suffering in one way or another, but there is no secessionist, separatist group in my country. The sense of nationhood is very strong.
Across the border in Pakistan.
Well, I'm coming to that point. Well, they tried for 35 years to empty us of our nationalism and make us extremists. We still remain nationalists. Remember, the Taliban changed Radio Kabul to Radio Sharia. They changed the dress of the Afghan National Army and they put the dress of the Pakistani Khasdar or FC to empty us of that strong sense of nationalism. But you are absolutely right. Former President Hamid Karzai sent me several times to Islamabad to warn the Pakistani establishment that you may think that by unleashing this chaos, you think this is controlled chaos. Eventually, this AFPAC border will become a territory neither you will be able to represent nor I will be able to represent. But think of it in long run. Those days, the Pakistanis were of the view that extremism is a child we have grown, we will be able to control it forever. Now they are facing a dilemma. The dilemma is part of the extremist groups are still their boys. Part of these extremist groups are trying to bite Pakistan. So what we are trying to say to the Pakistanis today, that it is still time that you take a principled stand against extremism in general, not be selective. But can ISIS exploit that void, that gap which has, as you rightly said, been created along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border? In my opinion, although a lot of people believe that it is President Ghani and his administration who has started a type of appeasing policy towards Islamabad, but we should not also forget another reality, that Pakistan today faces also a dilemma. Will Pakistan army make ISIS its ally, or they will fight it? And if ISIS does take root in that part of the world, which group will lose first territory to ISIS? Certainly it will be the Taliban. Now, why we are not fearful of rise of ISIS? For the following facts, I want to be very brief. A, Afghans have shown that they are very resilient and they are ready to take sacrifice. Two, the Afghan National Security Forces in this region, despite the fact that they suffer a lot, they are the most experienced forces fighting such groups. And three, the type of experienced countries like Iraq and Syria are going, we have long time ago passed over that. For us, the question is not what ISIS will do that the Taliban have not done. Those orange things only. The orange dress. Everything else, they have done it. So we are not afraid of ISIS gaining traction in my country.
Thank God for small mercies. There are lots of, we'll open the floor to questions now. Questions for our guests who've survived the ISIS and Al-Qaeda, for Professor Hakel and for Amrullah Saleh. Yes, sir, we begin with you. Can you give the mic?
Thank you very much. Perhaps the outer world may not realize that there are more Muslims getting killed than any other religion. In other words, would you agree that there is a civil war going within the Islamic world, whether between Shia and Sunni or more radical Shia? That's one. Would you agree there? And secondly, is there any solution to this?
Professor?
I mean, there's definitely a sectarian war that is happening, but it's not, I would say, necessarily intrinsic to Muslims or to Islam. I mean, behind this sectarian war that we see between Shias and Sunnis are states that are feeding this sentiment. So there is a war, a Cold War between, let's say, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And they each have proxies and actors who are fighting in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iraq. I mean, that's one dimension of it. So I think one has to also think of what states do, states that we recognize as states. If the Iranians and the Saudis, for example, and the government of Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates were not to try to fuel certain types of activity, certain types of sentiments, we would not see as much sectarianism, if at all. I think the first solution is to get the Iranians and the Saudis not to fight with one another through proxies. That would really help.
My question here is to understand, or if any of you there could reflect upon, how is it that we are hearing the same thing which was started with Taliban, and now it's ISIS, and now it was Boko Haram in Africa? How are we just finding the same situation in different names, and it's spreading like wildfire? As per you, what is the solution for something like this? The world has to adapt to see this reducing and finally getting over with, if there is a solution to it.
Is it for the professor or?
Yeah, it's for the professor.
Professor Hickel.
Okay. I think that the answer to your question has to do with misrule and bad governance. If the Taliban were a product of the civil war. I mean, first the war against the Soviets, and then the civil war that took place in Afghanistan, which led to the destruction of governance and in that country. So when you have political vacuum that is due to bad governance or the failure of government, basically failed states, that vacuum typically is filled by the types of groups that you alluded to. Northern Nigeria is also very badly run. You can see that the oil money that comes from the south in Nigeria was not going to the north, and the government didn't care. So the emergence of radical groups often has to do with bad governance.
Yes, ma'am. The lady behind you.
So my question is to the two gentlemen who have survived ISI's captivity. I'm sure it must have required tremendous amount of strength to actually survive that and come back and tell us about everything that you've been through. But I wanted to ask you that while you were there, did you at any point of time want to give up, like maybe die? And then I have another question. After you came back, after you had to get back to normal life, how hard was it to adjust to everything once again? Like how hard was it to come back and see everything?
Theo, you'd like to go first? Theo and then Nicholas? Yep.
All right. The first question is, how did I survive? Is that right? Okay. Well, they didn't. Did I want to end it all? I mean, I was very tenacious in my desire to live, and I still want to live. But there was a time when I thought that they were on the verge of killing me, and so I didn't want to allow them to do it in their own way. But I didn't survive because I have any special talent, or, I mean, there were other people. There was people in the cell next to me who died. It was just luck that the bombs didn't fall on us because we were under constant attack from the regime. They happened to feed me enough. They happened not to, they just didn't kill me. That's how I survived. The other question, I'm sorry, I forgot the other question. Oh, I've had a wonderful homecoming. Thank you very much. I love being here. I'm exploring the world, and it's so much better than being in prison. The food here is great. And thank you for having me.
Theo's answer was perfect. So I have nothing to add, and this is typically the kind of question I hate to answer, so it's perfect. Thank you, Theo.
But you speak Arabic. You speak very fluent Arabic. You've done a PhD on contemporary literature. Did that help, knowing the language, knowing their customs, culture? Were they kinder to you than to other foreign prisoners?
It helped me in terms of understanding what was happening among them, and perhaps also in the society outside our prison. But it could have been a liability in terms of my own safety and security.
They thought you were a spy.
They thought I was a spy, and they in fact brought me to court to be tried, I think on espionage charges, although they didn't explain. And I got myself in trouble with my Arabic. It's not perfect, and in fact there's a lot that I don't understand. You could also say I speak enough Arabic to get myself into very bad trouble. That's the truth.
Give us an example.
Well, when I went to court, for instance, it was just me and the judge. And the judge was speaking to me in a very legalistic, ornate kind of Arabic. And I understood 50% of it. And this is a capital charge that I was being tried for. And my trial lasted about 5 minutes, and I should have asked for a lawyer. There was a million things I should have done, and I just didn't think. I said, okay, I'll answer your questions, Your Honor. And that was a mistake. It was a mistake to go into Syria in the first place. I advise you all don't Stay away from Syria.
Okay. Mr. Chadda, you had a question?
Theo Nicholas. Sorry, yes. You know, obviously, one of the biggest fears for anyone is to die. You were there. I'm sure it ran, you know, amongst other thoughts. When does it stop? Does it stop that you wake up one day, every day you're thinking, I'm going to die, and then is there a day, because you were there for a long time, that you don't think about it anymore? I mean, you wrote a book. Was that to write, to get away from that thought, or does that thought really stop, and when does it stop?
You know, one has two lives. The second one starts when you realize you have only one.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
My question is to the professor. When this entire IS, story started, we've been reading so much about, how Iran can play a role in, resolving the crisis, and we haven't seen too much action from the West, either. So, we try to really understand, when do we see an intervention, or how is the world reading the crisis, or in terms of even attempting to kind of, see if it can be resolved in any manner.
Is your question how to resolve this problem?
Yeah, we've not seen any action on the IS front, and it just seems to be growing in its own way and, getting worse by the day, so,
Right, so, the Islamic State seems to be getting bigger and stronger because of, in Iraq, for instance, the government that America installed with Iran's help was a Shiite sectarian government that systematically discriminated against Sunnis. And so IS found a population of Sunnis that was willing to side with IS because they hated the government of Baghdad so much, because it was a government that was opposed to them. So right now, this government in Baghdad, with Iranian help and American help, is actually fighting the Islamic State, and the Islamic State might be severely weakened by this, will be, certainly.
Yes, but meanwhile, it's totally counterproductive to me. Because these people, who do we have currently on the field fighting the Islamic State? Westerners, mainly from the air, Shia and Kurds. We shall address the Arab Sunnis. Only them can solve the problem. They are the key for the solution. It's totally stupid to believe that just by sending these fighters, we could fight efficiently the Islamic State. These people, to have these people fighting the Islamic State is counterproductive, because all these people are perceived as occupiers, as invaders by the local population.
Okay. Ma'am?
Yeah, this is for Theo and Nicholas. Just a question. We heard you were captives. We just want to know, were you released or did you escape?
Both of us have been released.
You were released. And the reason was why release you both?
We must have been traded somehow.
Okay. Traded somehow. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, in my case, the nation of Qatar intervened. I don't think the American government was doing very much, and the nation of Qatar, using connections and influence that they have, that the U.S. government I don't think has, secured my release. I don't know anything more about the details than that, but I'm very grateful to them for saving my life.
Yes, of course.
Well, from my experience, one of the sources of income for such groups is when certain governments pay for terrorist groups to release their nationals who are kept captive. This is most of the time done for domestic politics or to shut a media coverage of the case. And it reinforces the belief within the terrorist group that keep kidnapping and keep that source of income open.
That's a very important point you're making there, Mr. Saleh. Should countries then not negotiate with hostage takers at all, Professor Hickel?
Well, in this case, it was the Qatari government, in Theo's case,
yes.
It was the Qatari government I think, negotiating on behalf of the American people to release him to please America, to please the United States, to please Americans. And so the Americans would not negotiate directly, and that's a policy. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a strong view on whether one negotiates with them or not. You know, they hold hostages, they trade hostages. I mean, one could imagine, for instance, a trade that doesn't just involve money. If you have prisoners of theirs, they have prisoners of yours, you could also have an exchange of that kind.
Okay. Rahul? Theo, Nicholas, in the time that you spent with these terrorists, did you spot any vulnerabilities, any weaknesses? What's the best way to defeat them?
Right. I mean, it's too late now. Everybody who is there, they're so deeply inside this bubble of religious enthusiasm and guns and proximity to death, proximity to the Quran, that there's no way to talk them back from the brink. They've crossed the bridge, and they don't want to come back. As Professor Heikel pointed out, they fully intend to die there. I mean, I believe that, there's a certain quantity of dead enders, you might call them, who they're just, they're waiting to be killed, and I think eventually they will be killed. I mean, the larger issue, as has also been mentioned, is that the Islamic State is asserting a certain degree of power and attraction over the minds of especially people and young Muslims in the West. And how do we counter this? I mean, we have to inform these young people of what they're likely to encounter once they get there. I mean, believe me, it's not all fun and games when they get there. A lot of these people want to go home, but they have no way to get home. I think it would be nice if we rescued some of these kids from the terrible situation that they themselves have put, they put themselves into, just the way I was rescued. I put myself into a bad situation, and thankfully somebody came to rescue me. Well, it would be nice if somebody took some of these young men and rescued them and, brought them back and rehabilitated them and reintegrated them into our society. I think that's possible.
Okay. Nicholas, Theo, Mr. Saleh, and Professor Heikel, many thanks for joining us, and many thanks for sharing your experiences and perhaps the road ahead. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, I request you to just stay on stage with me while I invite Sahil Malik, Managing Director, Dar Milano, to come up on stage and present a small token of our appreciation to this illustrious panel. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please have a big round of applause?